Hello and very good evening to all of you. So in the morning session, we talked about the cardiac physiology. So we are going to apply the concepts now. And without further delay, let's move into the MCQs. So the first MCQ, during the cardiac cycle, the first R sound, S1, is because of the closure of which valves? See, just a quick recap. As I told you, I cannot go into depth again in this session because it is going to take a lot of time. I'll just stick to the MCQs. I'll just explain in a short way. If you want in-depth concepts, you can watch the previous sessions. So during the cardiac cycle, the first sound S1. See, S1, if you see, it is because of the shutting of the tricuspid valves. Okay, so and the bicuspid valve. So what happens once the blood fills into the ventricles? Okay, so the blood fills into the ventricles, there is going to be contraction of the atrium. There's going to be more blood into the ventricles. So once the pressure in the ventricles exceeds the pressure in the atrium, okay, so the pressure in the ventricles, this is the right ventricle, this is the right atrium. Once the pressure in the ventricle, the right ventricle increases more than the right atrium, these valves, they are going to shut down. Okay, so it is going to close. So because of which we hear the S1 sound. S2 is because of the closure of the semilunar valves. What are the semilunar valves? It is the pulmonary and aortic valves. Okay, so the S1 is because of the closure of the AV valves, and S2 is because of the closure of the semilunar valves. So it's a very simple, straightforward questions. Don't make mistake in it. Okay. Now, moving on to the next MCQ. The phase of cardiac cycle in which both the AV valves and the semilunar valves are closed. Just immediately we have discussed it, just before we have discussed it, right? So in which phase? It is during the isovolumetric contraction. So isovolumetric contraction results in increased pressure of the blood into the right ventricles. Okay, so when there is contraction, there's going to be squeezing and the blood pressure is going to get increased in the ventricles. So because of which of the pressure differences, the valves are going to shut. And you have to remember at this stage, the pressure in the right and the left ventricle increases, but not more than the arterial pressure. What does that mean? The pressure here, it goes up. Okay, the pressure in the right ventricles and the left ventricle goes up, but still the pressure in the pulmonary artery and the aorta is more than the ventricular pressure. That is why the semilunar valves do not open. The pressure moves from higher to lower. So when the aortic and the pulmonary arterial pressure is more than the right and the left ventricular pressure, the semilunar valves are not going to open. And because of the increased pressure in the right ventricle and the left ventricle, the bicuspid and the tricuspid valves, they shut down. So in this situation, the isovolumetric contraction, both the valves are closed. Okay, this is a very important phase, S1. So the LUP sound is here during this phase. So it is during the isovolumetric contraction. Straightforward, simple questions. Never make mistakes. If you make mistakes in a simple questions, as I told you earlier, you are going to get pushed to at least 3,000 to 4,000 ranks. So moving on to the next question. 28-year-old patient came for a routine checkup. There was a soft S3 sound after S2. So there's no symptoms. There's normal ECG, and the S3 in this case is produced during the which phase of cardiac cycle? Okay, so as I told you, there are four phases, sorry. One is ventricular filling, isovolumetric contraction, ventricular ejection, isovolumetric relaxation. So what happens? S1, it is heard because of the closure of the AV valves. S2 because of the closure of semilunar valves. Once the pressure in the aortic arch and the pulmonary artery increases, the semilunar valves shut down so that the blood does not enter from the right and the left ventricles into them. So during this phase, S1 and S2 is there. So what is S3 is basically after the isovolumetric relaxation phase. So the four phases I have taught in the previous session, just go and watch it. So during the isovolumetric relaxation phase ends, what happens? The cycle again repeats, right? So there is a sudden rush of blood into the right and the left atrium, and that causes minimal vibrations in the ventricular wall. Okay, so during the rapid ventricular filling phase, okay, that is after the isovolumetric relaxation, there is a rapid ventricular filling phase. During this phase, there is rapid entry of blood into the atrium. There is rapid entry of blood into the atrium. So because of which there is going to be vibrations on the ventricular wall. Ventricular valves, and that is going to result in S3 sound. So S3 sound is normal. Okay. So the patient is having soft S3 after S2. There was normal ECG and there was no symptoms. So it is mainly because of the rapid ventricular filling after the isovolumetric relaxation phase. Okay, moving on to the next question. Frank Starling's law states the force of the cardiac contraction is directly proportional to. Okay, what do you mean by Frank Starling's law? Frank Starling's law states that the amount of blood entered, that is the venous return, is directly proportional to the cardiac output. That means, imagine, I'll tell you in this diagram itself, okay? So imagine that blood enters from the pulmonary vein. Okay, so what happens, there is going to be increased filling of the left ventricle. It's obvious, right? So pulmonary veins pushes the blood into the left atrium and there is going to increase blood in the left ventricle. So what happens is, because of the increased venous return, okay, the increased venous return, this is called as the preload or in diastolic volume. Okay, so there is, when there is increased venous return, okay, there is increased blood in the ventricles. Okay, so when there is increased blood, what happens, the atrium, it stretches. Okay, in this case the left ventricle stretches. So increased venous return, increased blood in the left ventricles, in the left and the right ventricles. So what happens, it stretches. So once the wall of the ventricle stretches, there is going to be increased contraction, that is opposing action is also going to get increased. So increased venous return, increased stretch, increased contraction. So as a result, what happens, when I squeeze it again, see, it expands like this and at the same time it squeezes like this. Okay, so what happens when it squeezes, so imagine when I am trying to squeeze this wall. Okay, so when I'm trying to squeeze this wall, more amount of pressure is going to go up into the aorta, so there's going to be more cardiac output. So Frank Starling's law states that when there is increased preload, increased venous return, there's going to be increased stretch of the vessel wall. So what happens, there is going to be increased contraction at the same time. Because of this increased stretch, increased contraction is going to take place, a reflex mechanism. So more amount of blood is going to come out, the cardiac output is going to get increased. So what is afterload is? Afterload is the resistance felt by the ventricles for pumping the blood. Okay, say for example, if I am not allowing these ventricles to dilate more, or if I'm not contracting it much, will the ventricles able to pump enough blood or increased blood into the aorta? Obviously no. So when there is less resistance to the ventricles, it can pump more amount of blood. Okay, so afterload is a ventricular resistance to push the blood into the aorta. Okay, so when there is increased afterload, increased resistance, that means there is increased resistance, there is going to be decreased cardiac output. When there is increased preload, there is going to be increased cardiac output. Okay, this is a very simple concept. Now moving on to the question. So Frank Starling's law states that the force of cardiac contraction is directly proportional to the end diastolic volume. Increase in preload, increase in cardiac output. So cardiac output will be increased when there is more preload. Okay, fine. Moving on to the next question. A patient with a pacemaker has an end diastolic volume of 120 ml and end systolic volume of 120 ml and end diastolic volume of 70 ml and a heartbeat or heart rate of 70 beats per minute. So what is the cardiac output? So what is cardiac output? Cardiac output is equal to stroke volume into heart rate. So in this case, there is no stroke volume. So how to calculate stroke volume? Stroke volume is basically end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. Stroke volume is end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. So in this case, 70 minus 120 is minus 50. Can a stroke volume be minus? No, it's obviously a wrong framing of the question. This was a question which was asked, okay? So here the question is wrongly framed. So in this question, they might have, they might have told that in diastolic volume as 120 and in systolic volume as 70 ml. So let us assume that this is positive, okay? So 50 ml. So stroke volume is 50. So 50 into 70, 3.5 liters. So in this situation, the cardiac output will be 3.5 liters. So cardiac output is stroke volume into heart rate. Stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped by the ventricles after each beat. What is heart rate? It is the heartbeats per minute. Okay, it's usually 70 to 75. Fine. In this case, it is the cardiac output is 3.5 liters. So moving on to the next MCQ, which is nothing but dp bar dt max is best described as. Okay, so what is dp bar dt? It determines the pressure to the time. So it is basically an ionotroph, a marker. Okay, it is a marker for contractility. It is a marker for contractility. What do you mean by that? So it is the amount of pressure a ventricle undergoes in time. So dp bar dt max is best described as, so the maximum rate or rise of the ventricular pressure using isovolumetric contraction. So when dp bar dt max is less, that means there is going to be decrease in the ventricular pressure. It is a marker for, it is a marker for contractility. It determines or it finds out how much pressure the ventricle is undergoing during isovolumetric contraction, whether the contraction is sufficient enough to pump the blood into the body. So it is a marker which is used to measure the contractility. So dp bar dt max is best determined by the pressure the ventricle undergoes during the contraction, isovolumetric contraction. Okay, now moving on to the next MCQ. There's the last MCQ. So a 58-year-old male man, when he stands up from the bed, he feels dizzy and the BP drops transiently and the heart rate increases within seconds. So when a person stands and the BP falls, there's going to be stimulation of baroreceptor complex. Why? Because there is going to be compensatory hypertension which should take place, right? So the patient BP falls, so the patient cardiac output reduces. So once the BP falls, what happens? The stroke volume reduces, so the venous return reduces. So imagine if I'm a patient, I'm standing up and I'm fainting. That means what is the significance is there is going to be decreased venous return. Okay, when I'm having decreased venous return, there's going to be decreased stroke volume. When there's decreased stroke volume, there's going to be decreased cardiac output. So what my body is going to do is it is going to stimulate the baroreceptors. Baroreceptors are present in the carotid body and aortic arch, right? So 9th and 10th cranial nerves. So carotid body just before the blood entering into the brain and aortic arch just before the blood pumps throughout the body. So once these are stimulated, there's going to be increased sympathetic stimulation. Sympathetic activity is going to take place, that is going to result in vasoconstriction, and the BP is going to be normal, or there will be rise in BP to compensate for the low BP that is occurring in the patient. So this patient stands up, feels dizzy, BP drops, and then what happens? It increases within seconds. That is because of the baroreceptor complex, that is the carotid body and the aortic arch. Okay, so with this the cardiac physiology comes to an end. So I hope it makes sense. So watch the concepts videos in the morning and the MCQs videos in the evening. So split your time morning and evening, and also don't forget to attend the test, so your preparation goes on at the same time you're getting exposed to the previous year MCQs. So thank you so much for watching the video. Have a nice day.